Welcome to the Knowledge for Men show. Your life will never be the same.
Your level of success will seldom exceed your level of personal development.
I want to die empty of regret. I want to die empty of my best work. We don't understand who we are. Instead, we're living out somebody else's narrative.
What one man can do, another man can do. If it's been done, it can be done again.
Being yourself and being your truest, most authentic self in every moment. If it scares you or makes you a little afraid, do it. Follow your heart and your gut.
The first stage, I think, is finding you, like finding out who I am today.
Stuff will not work. You will have things that fail. Success is when you're a happy, fulfilled person. How do you define success?
It's your life, and you are the creator of the movie script that is your life story.
Hey guys, just wanted to offer you a free gift here as a part of being a listener of my show. If you go to kfmfree.com, you can get the top 30 books and top 30 success quotes that every man must live by. So obviously every show we talk about books and we talk about success quotes. And so I've compiled the best of the best out of the last 100 episodes into a short guide. So kfmfree.com and it's all yours. All right, guys, welcome to the show. I'm here with Rodney King, and he's got a really interesting story here. He found himself sleeping on a bench, became a world-renowned modern martial artist, super successful entrepreneur, and coaches special forces military operators, and is now an author. So quite the story there. Rodney, how are you doing here?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to have you here too. So Rodney, we're going to dive into this story. Really, really interesting stuff, and I want to dive into your book as well. Before we do, we start off every show with a favorite success quote of the guest or some sort of saying that they've lived by that's helped them on their journey. So what do you got for us? And then share with us what that means to you.
Well, absolutely. I think my favorite kind of quote or saying of all time is that the principles of success are easy to understand, but hard to master. So, what does that mean to me is that probably the greatest lesson of my life was to learn how to be more present. And, as easy as that may seem, when you talk about it, it is really hard to master. So I've been really working hard to be more present in my life and in my training as a martial artist. And of course, when I'm working with people, regardless of who that is, from special force military units right through to the everyday guy and woman.
Yeah. So was this something that you struggled with, or was this just really focusing on the past or living in the future? Was that something from the past?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just if we talk about my life growing up, I was brought up on the south side of Johannesburg, which is similar to the projects in the United States. It's government housing. So growing up, I realized really quickly that how smart you were was irrelevant and how tough you were was. And so I had to have routes to get home safely from school. So when I wasn't dodging the neighborhood gangs, I was dodging the bullies at school. And growing up, I had an alcoholic mother who was very abusive, and she actually kicked me out of the house at 17. So I never finished high school, which is part of the intro that you discussed, where I found myself sleeping on a park bench, the same park bench that the same park that I played in as a kid. And so a lot of my life was really just fixated on the future, trying to predict what was going to happen next because I felt so out of control. And then at the same time, holding on to the past, of course, reflecting back on all the negative things that had happened to me. And so becoming more present really changed my life because, as often happens when people have had a really rough time growing up, they tend to use that as their excuse for not excelling in life. And I didn't want to be just another statistic.
Yeah. Did you feel like you were a victim? Kind of like, why is this happening to me? Like, why did I have to grow up in this area, this neighborhood? Why do I have to put up with this stuff? I'm just not supposed to succeed.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt that everywhere, obviously in my neighborhood, but even at school, the teachers would tell me all the time that I wasn't going to grow up and be anything, especially as I was training martial arts from a very young age. I didn't start martial arts to learn how to defend myself, but it quickly became that reason, just because I wanted to survive the mean streets. But I remember my mother telling me all the time, why are you wasting your time with this martial arts stuff? You're never going to amount to anything. So I can, vividly recall being around 15 and really just all I wanted to do was just end my life. Luckily, I didn't. And I really put that down to the fact that I had got deeply involved in martial arts. And I would say that ultimately that journey, going through the martial art experience, saved my life.
What were some of the key lessons that you learned in martial arts that saved your life?
Well, I think for one is that you realize that in order to achieve success, you have to put the work in, and that perfection is an illusion. And just when you think that you've got something right, there's always an obstacle. And so you really quickly learn to have grit, which I think is very important. I mean, we're talking about just getting through really tough times, is that idea of being resilient, so even though that the world is falling down around you, you're able to push through in spite of all the bad things. And martial arts really just gave me a lot of discipline, which I felt that was really important that time in my life. But it also gave me opportunities because I started teaching martial arts at quite a young age, actually probably around 17 at the time when I was kicked out of the house. And that really just enabled me to become an entrepreneur without having any schooling or background. And that kind of set the stage for me and becoming a success in my life.
Yeah. So what I'm getting is like the martial arts was almost like this training ground to master yourself. And once you've had this level of discipline and this level of presence, and you develop the skills of resilience, of grit, and just that toughness, you were able to then use these skills and apply them into the world of entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. I think, there's in hindsight, and it's something that I teach today as a workshop, but there were four main things outside of obviously the resilience and the other side of realizing that even though things aren't perfect, doesn't mean you can't take action, which I think is really important. And you realize that very quickly in martial arts, especially when you're confronted with an opponent that's much better than you. And all you want to do is run away, but you stick it out and you stay there, and you realize that even though you don't have everything perfect, all the techniques are not 100% perfect, you're still able to play the game. Coming out of that, there are four things, like I said, that really stood out for me. One of those is what I term grounded thinking, which I alluded to earlier on. I found that in martial arts, especially in a high performance environment, if you're projecting into the future or you're holding on to the past, say, for example, you made a mistake, you find very quickly that you get yourself into trouble. For one simple reason is that the only way that you can attend to an opponent is right there in the moment, in the present moment, because even though I might be thinking in the future or holding on to the past, the person in front of me doesn't stop punching me in the face.
Right.
So, the
blows keep coming.
Exactly. The blows keep coming. So that grounded thinking of remaining present and not attaching, to the future or holding on to the past was crucial in being able to, quote unquote, ride the storm, especially against opponents that I felt that were far superior to me. The second main component was what I call attitude embodied. And I realized that how you show up in the world really matters. How you hold your body can change the relationship between you and somebody else. Now, from a martial arts process, the way that you bring your body, if you think of, for example, like even in the animal kingdom, the way a tiger would stalk its prey, there is a certain kind of power in the way that tiger moves and the way that it moves its body. You don't even, you can just see it even on a TV, and you can see that power. And so that body attitude is crucial. And I found that in a martial arts setting, the way that I held my body would determine if I did well or not. So, for example, if I was in a tight structure, in a good fighting stance, I was able to play the game more effectively. Or if I was pulling out of my stance, opening myself up, not only did I get hit more, but it also kind of had a knockoff effect where it would affect my psychology and my physiology. I would feel vulnerable. So the way that you show up in the world really matters. And if we relate that back to the business world, we can see that, if somebody comes in, let's say they have to pitch an idea to a group of investors, it doesn't matter if they have a really great idea and their pitch is pretty good. Much of what that decision is going to be made on is how that person holds their body, because 70% of communication is nonverbal. So if you're standing there and you look not confident, you slouch, your shoulders are rolled, you're not making eye contact, your body attitude is going to say one thing, and that's what people are going to pick up on, not so much what you're saying. So that's that attitude embodied, which I found in martial arts was really powerful. The next point would be mindfulness in action. The ability to stay present in the moment without judgment is crucial, because it's the judgment, it's the attachment to the story and what is happening in the moment that gets you into trouble. If you think about a martial artist, if I was sparring somebody and all I'm focusing on is how badly I'm doing, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so what I had to learn was take a step back and allow whatever needed to arise without attaching to that story, without labeling it, without judging it. And being in that kind of place is a powerful place to be, because that's often in a martial arts or a sport environment where you enter the flow state, where everything slows down and it just feels like you can't make any mistakes, and every move that you make is the most efficient move that you could potentially make. And then the final aspect of that is exhale or breathing, because I found that, if you don't focus on your breathing in a high intensity, stressful environment, your performance degrades. And oftentimes, you will see that when people are giving a speech, for example, they get themselves out of breath, they mistime what they're saying, and as soon as they can't breathe, it affects them, just not in their ability to present what they need to present, but from a physiological standpoint as well, because we know that the breath is attached to the autonomic nervous system, that part of you what gets you ready for a fight, or to flee, And so when your sympathetic nervous system kicks off, the first thing that's going to go, not only is you going to feel all that adrenaline and the butterflies and everything else that comes with it, but it's also going to affect your breathing. And so one of the things that I learned is that focusing on the exhale, focusing on my out breath, engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the autonomic nervous system that is geared towards bringing you back to homeostasis, to balance. And I've used that successfully everywhere. I mean, you could imagine, for example, if I'm standing in front of a group of special force military operators, it can be quite intimidating at times. And the first thing that I notice is, that those physiological changes. And by focusing on my exhale, I'm able to keep myself calm, present, and focused. And I find that then I'm able to present my material in a much more confident way.
Yeah. So talking about the special forces, like how did this ever come into your story? At what point did special forces start asking you to train them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first off, I did serve in the South African military. I was part of the VIP protection unit, which is the bodyguarding group. I was also the lead hand-to-hand combat instructor for my unit. And then coming out of that, I've pretty much been traveling around the world non-stop for the last decade. I've been coaching martial arts in over 100 countries around the world. And through that process and just delivering my material, but making it also very clear that one of the things that I'm big on is inner management skills. And in the audience happened to be military operators, and they contacted me and said, hey, would you want to come out and teach these principles to our soldiers? Because I think there's something there that's very important. You're not only just teaching the physical application, which is one aspect of it, but you're also making sure that you're developing the inner game. So my first kind of foray into that was with 3 of the Special Forces military teams in the Slovak Republic, where actually I went to go and teach them not how to fight per se, no unarmed combatives training really, but what I focused on was inner management training. And so those aspects that I mentioned earlier, the idea of grounded thinking, attitude embodied, mindfulness in action, how to breathe under pressure and under stress, tied to resilience and understanding that everything is imperfect, and if you're waiting for perfect to happen, you're going to be waiting a long time, were the lessons that I imparted with them and taught to them. And they found it so beneficial to their roles on the battlefield that I started thinking, hold on a second, what happens if you take this outside of this and you start delivering it to anybody, especially entrepreneurs, because I love working with entrepreneurs. And so that's kind of the niche that I do these days, where I work a lot with entrepreneurs, helping them develop their inner management skills.
Yeah. And you said you've been traveling for 10 years. That really caught my attention, and really training and coaching different special forces units. What have you learned from the special forces units that that you just didn't see before in your life?
Well, I think in actual fact, it was kind of interesting is that one of the things that I talk about often is that performance is performance. So what it really was for me is that I realized that the very same things that we struggle with, if we can call ourselves civilians, on Civvy Street, the internal turmoil that we go through, special force operators have to deal with the same things, except albeit that they're in a combat environment where the consequences for them in making a mistake would be greater than for me or you, So in that sense, if they mess up, they lose their lives. And so, but I did realize that the most important thing that stood out for me was that the same things that they have to deal with, we have to deal with. And so I started thinking about the inner management in a way that is perennial, that if you can get that inner management skills right, I think you can transfer those skills almost to any environment, regardless of where you find yourself. Because if you're in a high stress situation, no matter if it's in a meeting or you're out on the battlefield, the physiological changes that you feel are very, very similar.
When you say inner management skills, are you talking about your state, like really controlling the state that you're in so that you can perform the job the best you can?
I would say so, but I would change the word control because I think there is this perception, especially like, for example, when we talk about fear, that there is somehow that you can manage your fear. So if we, or you can control your fear. So maybe a better way to define that would be to talk about it as managing your fear rather than trying to control it. So that was one of the things that stood out when I was working with special force military operators is that they feel fear just like you and me. Yet they going into an environment, like we said earlier, the consequences is they could potentially lose their lives, but they're still able to achieve success in the mission. And I think that comes down to what they have learned to do is to understand that fear is a natural, it's a natural emotion. The physiological changes that accompany them are natural. They're evolutionary. They're with everybody, regardless of, who they are and where they find themselves. If they feel fear, fear is fear. But the difference is they've learned to change their relationship to that fear. The way that they interpret it and the way that they manage it is very different. So I would argue that they're not trying to control it, but actually there's more a level of acceptance, which really makes a difference when you're going into a high stress situation.
Yeah. And so how do you help people manage their fears? If someone contacted you and they really wanted to break through what was holding them back, like how would you help someone manage that fear to help them walk through their fears?
Well, one of the best ways that I found, of course, as a martial artist, and that is my understanding and my experience and my knowledge base, is I'm a big advocate of an embodied process because I think you can sit and talk to somebody across a table and they can tell you about their fears and you can talk to them about what they should or should not be doing in order to manage those fears better. But it's still just talking. It kind of remains in the rational mind. And a lot of the times, as you probably realize yourself in your life, a lot of your fears tend to be irrational. They're not necessarily rational. We might rationalize them later on. So what I found is that one of the most powerful ways to help people overcome that is to actually get them on the mat, teach them martial arts, put them in a stress situation. Obviously, it's progressive. It's, not putting people in a stress situation that they're completely unable to handle, but enough pressure, enough stress for them to have very similar kind of responses to the things that they're saying that they're struggling with in everyday life. And then through that process, teach them how to manage that fear a lot better. And a lot of it comes down to what I've been talking about. It's making them understand and teaching them that thoughts are not reality, that they are fragments of history, and that when you don't engage with the thoughts, when you are able to be mindful of them without judgment, you put yourself in a very powerful place because you start to realize that regardless of how I feel or how I think, doesn't mean that I can't perform. But you can imagine that's very difficult to teach somebody if you're just sitting and having a conversation across a table. When you actually on the mat and you feel those physiological changes, but then I teach you those principles and you actually feel the embodied change. It's an amazing process because if you have an embodied change, unlike something that you intellectualize, it's very difficult then to forget that. It's something that becomes part and parcel of you. because it's invoking your body's natural intelligence in that moment. It's not just something that you are thinking about. And so that's pretty much how I approach it.
Yeah, I can see how that would help someone manage their fears. Now, does this go into your book, The Full Contact Living? What is your book about? And what does it mean, full contact living?
I think you summed it up there. I mean, this is what my book is about. I wanted to take these lessons that I have learned on the mat that have helped me, become super successful as an entrepreneur, helped me achieve success in my relationships, in my life, especially as a man, because in this day and age, it can be pretty difficult sometimes to know what it is to be a man. There's a lot of masculinity issues going around. And so I wrote the book just showing these lessons. And although they come from martial arts, the way that I wrote the book is that you can apply them to your everyday life. And that's, I think, how most of us see our life is it's like a fight, right? I mean, ultimately what I'm teaching people to do is to get ready for the martial arts of everyday life, because it's like a full contact fight. And if you learn how to engage with your inner management better, your inner game, and you know how to utilize those tools in every aspect that you find yourself in, no matter if it's at the office or it's at home or it's in a motor vehicle, or you feel that road rage coming on and you're able to be mindful in that moment and not attach to those emotions and those thinking, and you can be non-judgmental, you really start to find this balance point that I think is very important. So the whole book is geared towards how do you take the lessons from the mat into the world. So it's not just written for martial artists. Actually, you may or may not know who he is, but Naveen Jain, who is a serial entrepreneur, billionaire, wrote a really great review of my book because he loved it. And so it appeals even to the entrepreneurial spirit.
And so in the book, you have these 6 principles for peak performance. Could you briefly just kind of explain what all of those are?
Well, I've mentioned them already. I call it the iGamer method. So it starts off with the understanding of imperfection. And what I find is beautiful is that in Japan, they have the saying that they term wabi-sabi, which is seeing the beauty in imperfection. And as entrepreneurs, oftentimes what holds us back is that we want everything to be perfect before we make our next move. And what you have to realize is that nothing is ever going to be perfect. And if you don't start moving towards your goal, you're going to be just standing still for the rest of your life. So one of the things you have to come to grips with is that nothing is perfect, that everything is imperfect. So that's the first principle. The G stands for the grounded thinking that I mentioned earlier. First of all, being aware where your thoughts are. And if most people listening to this took the time out in a day, just even for 10 minutes to close their eyes and just label where their thoughts are, they'd find that the vast majority of their thinking is either in the future or it's in the past. And I can argue that, at times, of course, you need to be planning and you need to have goals. But at the same time, often we use that kind of thinking in the wrong situations. We want to use past or future thinking when we're communicating with somebody, when we should be completely present with them, or when we know that we have to perform. Let's say you get up and you have to give a talk. Now suddenly you find that it's not going so well, so you start almost planning what you're going to say next. And the more you try to plan what you're going to say next, the more you get yourself into trouble. So understanding, that you are either in the future or the past is the first step. And then within that section of the book, I actually teach some concrete tools that people can use to help themselves get back to a present tense perspective so that they can actually move from that place. The next step, as I mentioned earlier, is attitude embodied. And we now know that through research that the way you hold your body changes your physiology. And if it changes your physiology, it's going to change your brain. And if it changes the chemicals in your brain, it's going to change the way that you feel about yourself. So how you hold yourself is either going to make you feel confident or not confident. Knowing that and when to do it, as you can imagine, is crucial because, it doesn't help going into a high pressure, high stress situation where you have to perform, but but your body is saying a complete opposite. So by just changing the way that you hold your body, you can change the way that you think and feel. And most people don't realize that. The next one in the iGamer method is, as I mentioned earlier, mindfulness in action. This ability to be present without judgment. Mindfulness is getting a lot of attention these days, but I'm more interested in, forget about being able to do it on a Zafu and sitting in a nice candlelit room. Can you actually pull this thing off in the midst of a performance environment? You can imagine for me that might be sparring, but for an entrepreneur in the midst of a pitch or an important presentation, can they be mindful? That's very important. It's also very important for communication. How many of us sit and talk to people, and while we are listening to them, we're somewhere else? So we end up not taking in the whole conversation, but we also oftentimes then make errors in what we say next because we haven't fully comprehended everything the person has said because our mind has been somewhere else. So being mindful with people enhances our relationships. And then the next one is, as I mentioned, exhale, which is that understanding of, in a high stress situation, your autonomic nervous system is going to kick off. It's automatic. You don't have any conscious control over it. But one of the ways that you can control it is through your breathing. Knowing how to breathe can make the difference between you getting completely hyped up and potentially freezing and not being able to perform versus staying calm, focused, and centered. And then finally is the R in the iGamer method, which is resilience, which is the ability to bounce back even when things go wrong. But I would argue that if you get the other part of the method right first, then your resilience improves. And I found that for myself.
Do you think that resilience is the toughest one to master?
I think it is, but I think, if you work through the methodology that I mentioned earlier, and I would say that, growing up, I didn't have a method. I just thought feeling fear, feeling anxious, not having the ability to come back when there are setbacks, feeling like the whole world is out to get you. I thought was just how you lived. I thought that's how it was. And it was only later on as I delved deeper into my martial arts training and educated myself, because even though I didn't finish high school, I went back to college. I put myself back into college. I'm currently completing my PhD. So, I've done it and I'm near the success, seeing the fruits of my labor. But yeah, I think resilience is really difficult if you don't have any tools. And it's kind of interesting to me because I just did a workshop this weekend where I worked mainly with men, and I was talking to them. I was saying, imagine if you were given a class in inner management right in the beginning of your schooling career, because this is something that I think even children should be learning. Imagine if you were taught how to manage your expectations more effectively. Imagine if you were given tools to help you manage your fear better or to set goals appropriately as a child. I think we would see today a lot more successful people, and it wouldn't just be that 1% that seem to make it and the 99% that don't.
Yeah. It just seems so simple when you say it. Like, why aren't we teaching, how to set goals at such a young age and some of these success principles? Why do you think it's not like that?
Because I think, our education system is set up just to learn facts. They think that they're giving us a holistic education, but they're not really. I suppose depending on which side of the divide you fall on, it may even sound a bit conspiracy. But, to me, education is a form of control. It was designed for factory workers to build, to put widgets together. But at the end of the day, that's not how life unfolds. And I think it harks back to when you started off the interview, you said, give me a quote that is something that's resonated for you in your life. And I said that, the principles of success are easy to understand, but hard to master. Coming back, I think, if you've got a cookie cutter educational system where you just try to put as many people into a class as you possibly can, and the way that you assess them is just through tests, it's really difficult then to implement these things because this is something that has to be really done on an individual level. And I think maybe people think that it's going to be too costly to do that, or they don't really understand, how important this is. But it's kind of interesting that if I talk to any successful entrepreneur, the first thing they're going to tell me is that, it wasn't the knowledge that was the biggest problem for them. It was their inner opponent that got in the way. And that was the thing that they had to overcome. There's so many success workshops out there of very famous, well-known business gurus. And I always find it interesting that the first day that they focus the entire day on, overcoming your inner obstacles and not even talking about making money per se.
Right. Yeah. And it's the same too if you were to learn more about dating or relationships, or there's always such a strong focus on the inner game. And a lot of the principles are even similar. I really like the quote you said. The success principles, especially for listeners of this show, I've heard so many of them. I've interviewed so many different guests, and we hear the same thing. I'm giving a retreat this weekend, and some of the stuff that I'll share, you've probably heard before, but how many people have actually gone and mastered them? It's sometimes we hear something, we're like, oh, that's too basic. That's something that I could do. I've already heard that before. I've read that before. I don't need to pay attention to this. But how many people have actually mastered it? And that's kind of the, like, actually gone on and done something with it. That's kind of my thoughts on that.
No, I think you're right. And I think one of the things that I did was early on is I decided that, first of all, I recognized that it was important. I think most people can recognize that it's important. But as you noted, it's that inability to take action, right? Because that really is what decides you're going to get it right or not. And so I set intentions, intentions in the sense of saying, well, this week, this is what I want to achieve. And I would work at it no matter if it took 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or 3 days, and I wouldn't let it go until I felt that I achieved it. But within that, though, I've got a caveat, because I think this is kind of important for me, is that whenever I've set a goal and I said, this is what I want to achieve, and I said, for me, the intentions are like the steps leading up to the goal. And what I typically do is maybe a little bit different to most people, is I look at the end goal because that's what I want to achieve. Then I think about how would I reverse engineer this? If you had to have, how many steps would it take to get to that goal? Let's say, for argument's sake, there's 10 steps. I put the hardest thing, or what at least at that moment in time, what I think is the hardest thing, I put it right at the end. I put the easier things to achieve in the beginning. Because I found that if I set the intention to achieve the easy things, it boosts my confidence, which then gives me that kind of feeling that I can at least manage the next step. And so I kind of work it out so it starts from the easiest to the hardest. Now, the next point that I found that was really important, which comes back to this idea of imperfection, is I realized that when I say I want to achieve step one, I'm likely never, ever going to achieve 100%. I mean, nobody ever achieves 100%. You're never going to be 100% happy with anything. In my mind, kind of look at it and say, where is the 70% point? And once I hit it at 70%, I move to step two. And I realized that, even though there's still that 30% that needs to be worked on, as I move into step two, you never forget step one. You're always working at step one. You're always working on it in some shape, way, or form. And eventually it will get to what we could consider the closest is to 100%. And I keep doing that. So step two, I get to 70%. Once I feel I've got 70% of step two, I go to the next one, and so forth and so forth. And before you know it, you're standing there and you've achieved your goal. And when people say to me, but I don't know what the steps are, I turn around to them and say, there's got to be somebody that you have read about, or maybe even somebody who's achieved this. Go out, ask them, what steps did they take to get to that goal? Use that as your steps. Put the easiest ones first, the hardest ones at the end. Start working on that first step. Set that intention. Make sure you achieve it regardless of how long it takes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 days, get it to about 70%, then move to step two and continue the process.
Yeah. I kind of go the same way too, to build momentum. So it's kind of like a little snowball. Mm-hmm. You kind of take on these little tasks, and then you just start getting momentum to where by the time you get to the hard task, like you've already done so much that you're going to take this hard task out. This does go against the, Brian Tracy has that book, Eat That Frog. And he says the first thing that you want to do is go for the hard task first.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that, though, because in my experience, even just training people is a good example. It's like saying to somebody that came in here and they said, look, I want to train you with you, Rodney, but my goal is to get into the ring and spar. That's ultimately what I want to be able to do. And imagine if I took that person and I threw them in the ring on day one. Well, not only are they going to get the beating of their life, they're never going to come back. They're going to quit immediately. But if I do something that even the military uses, which is called progressive stress inoculation, where you start off at the things that people can handle, that doesn't mean it's not challenging, it's still challenging, but they can handle it. And then you slowly dial it up and you start increasing the stress. Military operators use that process all the time to great effect. So, just by dialing up the stress slowly and slowly, you acclimatize, but then you go to that next level and it's a little bit more challenging, but you can meet the test if, once you put your mind to it and you continue down that process, eventually you're going to find yourself at that success point. So I think it's dangerous just to throw yourself into the hardest possible thing first, because there's a very strong likelihood you haven't developed any skill or the ability to take it on. And when you're unable to achieve it, you're going to quit. And I would argue that one of the major reasons why so many people don't achieve is because they want to start, when they think of a goal, they want to start one step away from where the success happens. And I feel that's unrealistic. I think that once you've ever trained in a performance environment like martial arts, you realize that very quickly. You cannot just throw yourself into the end game or just one step before the end game. You have to slowly, methodically work your way up to it, progressively increasing the stress. And by doing that, you achieve success. And at the same time, while you're doing that, you are developing resilience for the next time you set a goal, because you've already achieved the goal and you understand that you need to slowly build yourself up to it, that snowball effect that you mentioned earlier. Then the next goal, I think, is even easier to achieve. So what I found is that my first goals I set took quite long to achieve. Now when I set a goal, I'm getting there a lot quicker, a lot faster.
Right. Because what's easy to you is also hard to someone else, because you built so much momentum that your goals now are much higher at a higher level. And so you're just really going through, and I guess the full contact living.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, again, just because I'm using martial arts, because that is my reference point, it's like if you came in and you watched me on the mat sparring people, I don't think that that's such a big deal, but you, maybe potentially as somebody who's never trained in your entire life before, are going to sit on the sideline and go, this is madness, man. There's no way I can do that.
Right. You got to start with the white belt and then the blue belt and then whatever belt system you're on. But you start with the lowest belt and move up the ladder to the black.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why if you did call me up and you said, hey, Rodney, I want to come and train with you, I would say, absolutely, man. But I wouldn't let you watch one of those classes.
Right. You got it.
Because if you watch the class, you're not going to come back.
Right.
You can maybe appreciate what you see. You can say, wow, that's amazing. But you're immediately going to turn it back on yourself and go, there's no way I can do that. And that's not true. Because if I take you through the process systematically through progressive stress inoculation, I can get anybody there. And I have. I've trained tens of thousands of people. Some of those people have gone on to compete in the UFC. So I know it's possible. People that I never thought would ever be able to do that, initially when I met them, have been able to achieve amazing success through the process by following that formula.
This is really good and really enjoying the way this interview is going. Let's now dive into a part of the show I call the knowledge round. Just going to ask you some rapid fire questions here, Rodney. So are you ready for the knowledge round, Rodney?
Let's do it.
All right, guys, if you're not reading books, then you're getting left behind. Somebody spent their entire life learning some invaluable lesson, and the best format that anyone could ever put it in is a book. It's the shortest, fastest, simplest way to consume content. So I know there are so many books available, and we talk about books all the time on the podcast, so there must be so many running through your head, and you're wondering, where do I begin? Well, I've compiled the top 30 books and success quotes from all of my guests in the last 100 episodes. So you can get them all for free. If you go to kfmfree.com, you can simply download the top 30 books that every man must live by. Again, that's kfmfree.com. Welcome to the Knowledge Round, where the guests will be asked rapid-fire questions to give the audience invaluable pieces of wisdom to help transform their lives. Starting in 3, 2, 1, showtime. What I'm noticing about your journey here is this sense of purpose, where knowing what direction that you wanted to go in, and then with martial arts and with entrepreneurship, and with training different, coaching special forces, and now writing your book, really gives you this sense of direction and helps guide you. What advice would you give to someone who doesn't have that sense of direction and they're really feeling lost and unsure of their purpose?
I think everybody has a purpose. If they're really honest with themselves, I think most people are afraid to follow their dreams because somebody else has told them that it's a waste of time. Just like the teachers and my mother told me, you're wasting your time with the martial arts. You're never going to amount to anything. And so I think you just need to find what you really believe in, what you really want to achieve, regardless of what anybody else is saying around you, and just go for it. Because if I had listened, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah. And what was holding you back from becoming the man you are now today, Rodney?
The thing that held me back the most was fear of actually engaging with my softer side as a man. I always believed that to be a man, you had to be tough, rugged, and somebody that other men feared. And that was really the thing that held me back. And it was only when I started understanding, if we could call it the art of the martial, that my life began to change.
So this is a really big topic. You're right. And really finding that balance between the hardness of the masculine and also the softness of the masculine.
It is, but I think what stood out for me was just having compassion for myself, that I had to come to grips with my edges, that, it wasn't just about being tough, that actually being really tough is your ability to be soft, is your ability to be open, to be compassionate, to be somebody that cares, that has empathy. These are the things that you start to realize is what it really means to be tough as a man, because it is really tough for a man to do that.
It takes a tremendous amount of courage to open up and be vulnerable. I mean, that's even harder than just being tough and just grunting. And I feel like masculinity is viewed in this way where it's like only the tough. But I think it's equally, like you just said, it's equally tough to show compassion and to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think, as easy as it sounds, I made a choice. I decided that that's what I was going to explore. I came from, like I said, a really hard background. And when I got involved in martial arts, I imported that kind of behavior into it. So for a long time, I was, quote unquote, hyper competitive, all about winning. I would measure my self-worth based on who I could or could not beat, but it didn't make me feel any more secure. In actual fact, it made me more afraid. I was more afraid, less confident, less self-assured, even though, ironically, I was winning all the time on the mat. That was always interesting to me. And so the thought to myself was, if I'm winning all the time physically, and this is what we define as the pinnacle of masculinity, why do I still feel so afraid? Clearly, this is not the way to go. And so I overhauled my whole approach. I called in all my trainers at that time and I said, this is how I'm going to change my life. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I need to, otherwise I'm going to go insane. Pretty much 99% of the guys that day got up and walked away. And I was left on my own. I had to rebuild my entire business from ground zero. And this is where my martial arts program, Crazy Monkey Defense, came from, where I said, if I'm going to teach martial arts, it's about making a difference every time I step on the mat. It has to change people's lives for the better. If I don't, so it's all about intention, I think is what I'm getting at. My intention changed. And the minute my intention changed and I wasn't going to do anything that would jeopardize that made a huge difference in my life. I decided then and there that, if I had a guy step up on the mat now who wanted to kick my ass and wanted to take me out, I would just say, no thanks, and walk away. That takes enormous amount of courage, because in our world, what the kind of labels that you get when you do those kinds of things.
Right. Yeah, tremendously. A lot of courage is involved in that. So now, on this journey, there had to have had been some people that have helped guided you, probably in the martial arts space, in entrepreneurship. But could you name just one man or person who's had a tremendous impact on your life, like a mentor? Who is this person and how have they impacted you?
Sure. I think the first name that comes to mind is nobody that I ever met. It's just I read all his books and I watched all the videos that he had produced. Was a man named Joseph Campbell, who was a comparative mythologist. And what he realized and what helped me was that he said, if you look at all the mythologies throughout time, specifically the mythologies that had warriors in them, there was always this monomyth, this journey that seemed to have come up. And then all heroes go through certain steps in order to achieve success. But the main thing that stood out for me was that he said that the hero's journey is never completed unless you come back to your society and contribute in a positive way. And at that point where I was high on the red road, as I like to describe it, where I was the ultimate fighter and I was doing fantastic and nobody could beat me, sure, I was great at that, but I wasn't really changing lives for the better. I wasn't contributing. And as Joseph Campbell reminded me as I read all his work, was that you will never understand what it is to be a warrior until you come back and you contribute. And that was the thing that I had to do. And that really kind of set me on the path to start making the changes I needed to make in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a powerful, Joseph Campbell, like really looking at that hero's journey in how so many of like our greatest stories of our time follow that same pattern. I was wondering, like, do the directors know about this? Because it's the same format of like, you know, the hero, and then he leaves, he meets like a mentor, and like even if you just look at like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, like they follow the even biblical stories, and even in different religions, just following this hero's journey. And what I love about it is it inspires me to live that story too. Like, you've got to leave, you've got to go out, you've got to go on this adventure, and you've got to experience, you got to fight the dragon. And the dragon could be whatever your demon is, like whatever it is, and really battle with that and come back hero. I just love this story, and I try and model that.
It's a great story. And actually, you know, when you fight the dragon, you realize that there was never a treasure behind the dragon. What was behind the dragon was your shadows. So by fighting that dragon, you befriend your shadows. And that's very powerful. I think one of the things in the cult of optimism that we find ourselves in the modern Western world is this constant, you know, harping on about being optimistic, being positive. If you believe it, it will happen, which is fine. But there is also a lot to be said about befriending your shadows, because oftentimes you can be as optimistic as you like, but if the stuff inside is holding you back, if the shadows are holding you back and you don't befriend them, you're never going to achieve success.
Yeah. Really good. And talking about Joseph Campbell and his books, what would you say are 2 or 3 of your most influential books, and why?
Yeah, good question. So even if it's not, can I change it from Joseph Campbell to somebody else?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it was kind of interesting. When I was 17, I read Freedom from the Known by Krishnamurti. And I didn't understand what he was talking about because that was like a crazy, insane spiritual book. I just didn't get it, right? But I obviously must have got some of it, maybe unconsciously. So definitely that is a book that's stuck with me and something that I revisit often, because I feel that it's a very powerful thing when you read that book, you know, especially not to take yourself so seriously, especially when you understand that your ego drives everything else. And so it's a beautiful book just to come back to yourself, to who you truly are, and in a balanced place. I think that's definitely one book. I love anything, if we're talking business, I love anything by Seth Godin. The books like Tribes, I think is fantastic. I think if you're an entrepreneur and you're not reading Seth's stuff, I think you're really missing out. I think it's a fantastic book. One of my favorite also business books as well that really helped me out in business is Brand Against the Machine by John Michael Morgan, which I thought was a really fantastic book to read, especially if you're in the business world. So there are 3 books just that popped into my mind that I would say that, you know, everybody should read.
Nice. I'll have to be checking out some of those books. And of course, yeah, Seth Godin, Tribes, Purple Cow, Indispensable. He's just got, or Linchpin, so many good books.
Well, great.
Yeah. And now, let's see here. This is more of a scenario here for you, Rodney. So imagine you had 60 seconds with 20-year-old Rodney. You got to, right now, you could sit down with him, go back in time. You know, what would you tell him to do? And what would you tell him not to do?
I would tell him that he needs to trust his intuition. And one of the things that would put him in a position that would not allow him to trust his intuition was his constant fixation on never being good enough.
Yeah. And that is all.
And that is all. Because, yeah, I think, like I said, coming back to what I said early on, I think oftentimes we want to overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
And, you know, coming back to that initial quote that we started off with, is that I've realized that the principles of success are easy to understand, but they're hard to master. So even if I said that to, you know, my younger self, that doesn't mean that I would immediately get it and that it would be easy to master. I'm still trying to master just the things that we talked about throughout this podcast.
Right.
Trying to be more present in my life is easier said than done when, you're dealing with the world and it throws you curveballs and, things don't always go the way that you would like them to. But if I trust my intuition more, I find that I'm able to deal with a lot of things that typically I wouldn't have been able to deal with before. Because in the past, you get so fixated in your thinking process that you can't even see that there's a difference between the observer that sees the thoughts and the thoughts themselves. It's almost like you completely get entangled in it and you can't separate yourself out. And it's a very powerful place to be able to observe the way that you're feeling and you're thinking and see it as it is. That's thinking. You can even label it if you want to. You can say, there's fear, there's anger, there's frustration. But if I just leave it like that and I don't engage with it, I don't create a narrative, a story around it, I give a reason why I feel afraid or a reason why I feel fear, then it never gets that power inside of me that takes hold of me. And as we probably all have this experience as human beings, it's when we allow the fear and the anger to take hold of us and we can't separate ourselves out from it, is when we make the biggest mistakes in our lives. So that would be something I wish I could go back and tell myself to change, because I probably would have got here a lot faster. But then we can argue that maybe this was the journey I was supposed to take, right, so that I would learn the lessons that I've learned. I also believe that as well. I believe that, as I look back on my life, it is almost like my life was planned, that there was somebody had orchestrated my life. All these things were put there, these obstacles per se, were put there to help me achieve the success that I've achieved today.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm very happy with who I am. And if you ask me, would I want to be anybody else in the world? I wouldn't change myself for anybody else. I wouldn't want to be anybody else at this moment in time of my life. Now, if you asked me that younger Rodney, I'm sure he would have given you a completely different answer.
So then that's almost the lesson right there, is that, the unfortunate circumstances that you were experiencing in your growing up was exactly the type of environment that you needed to become the man you are now today.
Sure, absolutely.
Really good. So, Rodney, what do you think is like one underrated characteristic that you believe every man should work on?
I think we hinted to it. I think every man should spend some time just being more compassionate to himself, not being so hard on himself all the time, and not buying into the prevailing status quo of what it is to be a man in the modern world. Is that I think once we learn to befriend ourselves and be compassionate with ourselves, we become very different, not only to ourselves, but everybody else around us. I'm a better friend, a better husband, just better all around, because I took the time just to lessen the load on myself and, to say to myself that it's okay. It's okay to be afraid. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's kind of what I've tried to set up in the teaching environment that I have. And I think it's very unique in the modern martial arts world, is that it's okay to say that you're afraid. It's okay to say that you're angry. That doesn't make you a bad person. But let's find a way to take that energy and mold it into something that can be positive and constructive. But I don't think that's possible unless you start from a position of being compassionate towards yourself. That just being a little bit less hard on yourself can make a huge difference. I was so hard on myself growing up. I felt that the reason all this bad stuff was happening was because it had to be about me. And it wasn't about me. I was just in a really bad place at the wrong time. And so like Viktor Frankl said, one of the most powerful things that you can have as a human being is to choose your own attitude in any given moment in time. So I choose to be more compassionate to myself. And by doing that, I open myself to experiences that if I was hard, I would never see. And if I didn't see those, I would really not see as much of the world and the world in such a beautiful way that I have and I am, today.
Yeah, and I think just understanding that you have the option to choose. You can actually come to the present and choose the path that you'd want to take. I think that's very liberating.
I think, that to me is an important, Yeah, that's an important lesson, is you have the ability to choose. I think a lot of times we think that the external circumstances, we use those to blame the reason why we feel and think a certain way. But it's not so much, if we understand that, it's not so much what is happening on the outside that is the problem. It's how I'm interacting to those problems, how I'm attaching to those problems that are happening on the outside that's causing me the problems. And so that if I can realize that I can choose my attitude and how I'm going to attend to those problems, can make a huge difference in how I deal with them in the end.
Yeah, really good stuff here. And so now, Rodney, even if you have to summarize some of your main points, perfectly okay, want to know, what would you say is your philosophy on life and success?
I think my philosophy is that it's twofold. I think you need to trust that you are the captain of your own ship, and that you need to be steering that ship and choosing your own attitude and not allow other people to do it, which so many people do. They allow other people to make choices for them. And I think that's super important, definitely. And then ultimately being more present, secondly to that, is really where it's at. And, being more present in your life really just opens up your awareness to things that you typically wouldn't see, or things oftentimes that you take for granted.
Yeah. You have the power to steer your own ship, and sometimes we let others steer it for us. Others, maybe like society or just our environment. What is
family members, they might want the best for you, but at the end of the day, you still have to, it's still your journey. It's still your hero's journey. You need to go on the journey. Yeah. Nobody can do that journey for you. And I think that's very important. And that was the realization. If I back then waited for things just to happen, for success to happen, or I waited for people to help me out, I would still be waiting. So I took charge of my life, and I decided that I was going to be the captain of my ship. I was going to be in charge of my hero's journey. I was going to go on this journey and find the tools and the strategies and the tactics and the teachers that I needed to find in order to succeed. And of course, you want to find the teachers that are thinking and feeling the same way and honoring the same way that you're feeling. So that's very important as well. It's pointless having a teacher that you just don't resonate with. And so I think that's also important. But I think once you've decided that you're going to captain your own ship, then it's amazing how, as the saying goes, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Just letting that soak in. Really good knowledge here. And I know so much of my audience is loving all of this here. So that's going to conclude the knowledge around there. And so what would you say is exciting you today? Like, what's really getting you out of bed in the morning?
Well, I think that's easy. I think just adding value. For so long, it was all about me. I was obsessed about myself. It's kind of that narcissistic pursuit of just, especially in the fight world, you can really go down what I call the red road. And so waking up in the morning and knowing that I can make a difference, completing the hero's journey that we talked about, coming back and contributing. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think my story is powerful. It shows that regardless of where you came from and the situation that you found yourself in, that doesn't have to define your future. You can change your future by changing your attitude. But, I had to learn that myself. Now, I may be lucky that I came out the other side, but coming from my neighborhood, pretty much everybody I grew up with is in prison or still living there, and their entire lives have fallen apart, or they haven't gone anywhere. So getting up in the morning and especially working with men and showing them that there's another way to engage with themselves in the world, because I really believe that there is no such thing as a negative emotion. Emotions get such a bad rap, aggression and so forth. Well, the reason you get up every morning and the reason you move towards your goals is because you have that aggressive energy. You can choose to use it in a positive way, or you can choose to use it in a negative way. Sadly, many men use those energies in the wrong way, but I think it's because they don't fully apprehend it, they don't fully understand it, And now that I'm in my 40s, and I guess, quote unquote, the old guy, right? A lot of young guys will listen to me, but they will listen to me because of my story, because of where I came from. You know, if I came from silver spoons, the affluent neighborhoods of my country, I never had to struggle for anything, I don't think the people that I work with would want to listen to what I have to say. So I think my story is a powerful way to get this message across, and that's what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, this is really good. And go ahead and give yourself a plug, Rodney, on how the audience can follow up with you moving forward.
Well, absolutely. Well, 2 places straight off the bat. Easiest one is coachrodneyking.com. They can find me there. Or if they want to check out my book, or I've got a free online video course that covers the stuff that we talked about in this interview, they can go to fullcontactliving.org.
All right, Rodney, thank you so much for sharing your story and so much knowledge here with us today. I want to thank you for your time. And this is really just going to go on and make a big impact with a lot of my listeners.
Well, I hope so, Andrew, but I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really honored to have been a guest.
Thank you for listening to the Knowledge for Men podcast. Hundreds of interviews and 1 million downloads later, we're continuing to build an international movement, and we've just started. So if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and leave a review in iTunes. It really helps to grow the podcast. Guys, 2015 is the official year of living with purpose, where every day you do only the things that matter to you. You wake up, live with purpose, and take massive action towards the life you want. Check out kfmfree.com to get free tools I've created to help you crush life. Again, that's kfmfree.com. This is your host, Andrew Farabee, and I'll see you in the next episode.